8 industrial gas turbine engines sat on the concrete lot of a two-bay machine shop in Milwaukee. Corroded housings, oil-blackened intake ports, rust bleeding down every seam. They looked like scrap. Megan Collier stood 10 feet from the nearest one, a legal folder pressed against her side. She had come with a number: $8 million. Brett Lawson stood in the doorway of his shop, grease on his forearms. He did not look at the folder. He walked past her, stopped at the closest engine, and placed his hand flat against the casing. His palms settled into the metal the way a hand settles onto something it has touched 1,000 times. Megan watched his fingers find a seam along the housing without searching for it. Something in the way he touched that engine told her more than every page in the folder she was carrying. Neither of them spoke. 8 engines dumped like garbage at a stranger's shop. $8 million to buy them back. But what happened between those two moments is the real story, and it starts right here. Brett Lawson ran a small machine shop on the industrial south side of Milwaukee, a two-bay operation called Lawson Machine Works wedged between a plumbing supply warehouse and a fenced gravel lot. The building was cinder block and corrugated steel, with a roll-up door that stuck halfway if the temperature dropped below freezing. The lot behind it was wide and flat, cracked concrete, chain-link fence, a rusted dumpster in the far corner. Brett was 39. He had owned the shop for 2 years. Before that, there had been a different life, one that left traces in small details if anyone cared to look. A certificate of commendation from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers tucked behind a parts catalog on the top shelf. A set of precision calipers too expensive for the kind of work the shop did, kept in a velvet-lined case in the bottom drawer. A second coffee mug on the shelf above the sink, never used, never moved. His wife Amy had been gone since the fall of 2022. A car accident on I-94 during an early snow. Brett did not talk about it. The only evidence was the mug and a particular stillness that came over him some evenings when the light through the roll-up door turned the color of rust. His son Jake was 9. He came to the shop after school most days, dropped his backpack on the metal stool by the parts washer, and did his homework at the workbench. He was a quiet boy, the kind who watched more than he spoke. When Brett needed a wrench or a socket, Jake handed it to him without being asked. The morning the engines arrived, Brett was rebuilding a hydraulic pump for a landscaping company. He heard the truck before he saw it, a diesel flatbed from Lakefront Disposal, backing through the gate at 7:45. The driver climbed down and jerked his thumb toward the load. 8 industrial gas turbine engines, each one roughly 7 feet long and 4 feet across, mounted on steel pallets, caked in grime and corrosion. The driver handed Brett a disposal manifest from Collier Power Systems listing 8 LX8 prototype units classified as decommissioned scrap. No bill of sale, no transfer agreement, no signature line. One authorization name at the bottom, Paul Linden, VP Operations. Brett told the driver he had not agreed to accept anything. The driver shrugged, said the delivery address was on the manifest, and that his job was to drop, not to argue. He lowered the engines onto the lot with a hydraulic crane arm and drove away. Brett walked the row slowly. He stopped at the third one. He ran his hand along a weld seam near the turbine inlet. His fingers traced the bead the way someone traces handwriting they recognize. He pulled his hand back. He stood there for a long time. 14 miles north, in a glass-walled conference room on the 9th floor of a building that bore her family's name, Megan Collier sat at the head of a mahogany table. She was 35. She had been the CEO of Collier Power Systems for 18 months, since the death of her father, Arthur, who had founded the company in 1992 and run it for 3 decades. $400 million in annual revenue. 1,200 employees. A Milwaukee institution. Megan had grown up around the business, but never inside it. She had studied finance, worked in private equity in Chicago, and returned to Milwaukee only when her father's health failed. She inherited a company she understood on paper, but not in its bones. Across the table, Paul Linden, 53, VP of Operations for 19 years, was presenting a quarterly inventory write-off. Dozens of line items. Obsolete tooling. Decommissioned test equipment. Near the bottom, 8 LX8 prototype turbine units. Recommended scrap disposal. Estimated residual value 0. Megan approved the write-off in batch. She did not read each line. That evening, Jake sat at the workbench with his math homework open, watching his father through the roll-up door. Brett was standing in the lot, hands at his sides, staring at the row of engines. Jake slid off the stool, walked to the coffee machine, filled a mug, and carried it outside. He held it up without a word. Brett took it without looking down. Jake went back to his homework. Brett opened the housing of engine number 3 the next morning. He used a ratchet and a breaker bar, working the corroded bolts carefully, one at a time. The housing panels came away in sections, revealing the turbine assembly underneath, coated in dust, dry seized in places, but structurally whole. He crouched beside the exposed internals and aimed a flashlight into the compressor section. The beam swept across a row of nickel-cobalt alloy blades, each one a precise curve designed to channel combustion gases at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. The blades were dull with tarnish, but they were uncracked, undamaged, intact. Then the flashlight caught something stamped into the interior wall of the turbine housing, 3 letters and a date, pressed into the metal in small block characters. BRL 04 2019. Brett Lawson's initials. His engineering stamp. He lowered the flashlight. He sat back on his heels and put one hand on the edge of the housing. He had built this engine. He had built all 8 of them. From 2014 to 2021, Brett had been a senior propulsion engineer at Collier Power Systems. He had joined the R&D division at 32 and spent 7 years designing the LX8, a next-generation industrial gas turbine intended for high-efficiency power generation. The project was his from the beginning. Concept through computational modeling, metallurgical testing, prototype fabrication. 14 patents bore his name. 3 industry awards sat in boxes in his garage. The LX8 was built around 2 proprietary innovations: a cooling geometry that allowed the turbine to operate at temperatures 40 degrees above the industry threshold, and a nickel-cobalt alloy blade composition that resisted thermal fatigue across tens of thousands of operating hours. Only 8 prototypes had ever been manufactured. Each one carried Brett's engineering stamp inside the housing, a practice he had adopted during fabrication to track which assemblies he had personally inspected. In 2021, the company's entire R&D division was eliminated. The restructuring had been proposed by Paul Linden, who argued in a memo to the board that the LX8 program was commercially unviable and that the division's resources should be reallocated to existing product lines. Brett was reassigned to technical documentation, a desk in a windowless office, cataloging specifications he had written himself. He resigned within 4 months. Now all 8 prototypes were sitting in his lot, classified as dead. But they were not dead. Brett spent 3 days inspecting each engine. The turbines had been neglected, no lubrication, no corrosion protection, but the cores were intact. Every one. These engines had not failed. They had been abandoned. That same week, Megan received a call from a program director at the Department of Energy. The DOE's Advanced Turbine Program was soliciting proposals for a next-generation efficiency initiative, a contract worth $200 million over 5 years. The program required a turbine exceeding current efficiency thresholds by 12%. The LX8 met that specification, and the DOE needed physical prototypes for certification testing. No simulations. The actual hardware. Megan pulled Paul into her office. Where are the LX8 prototypes? Paul told her they had been destroyed per standard decommission protocol. 6 weeks ago. Catastrophic metallurgical failure. All 8 units. Megan pulled the write-off report, the one she had approved without reading each line. There was no destruction certificate attached. No EPA disposal record. No scrap facility receipt. She looked at Paul across the desk. He was already talking about alternative approaches. She was not listening. Now here is where this story turns. Because what those engines were and who built them is only half of it. The other half, the reason $8 million landed on that table, starts with what Megan Collier did next. Megan ordered a full audit of the LX8 disposition within 24 hours. She pulled every record attached to the 8 engines, procurement files, storage logs, maintenance schedules, and the disposal authorization Paul had submitted with his signature on every page. The documentation classified all 8 engines as catastrophic metallurgical failure. The report described blade root cracking, thermal fatigue propagation, and housing deformation consistent with end-of-life degradation. It recommended immediate destruction. But the paperwork stopped there. No destruction certificate from a licensed demolition facility. No EPA Form 8712 for hazardous materials handling. No scrap yardway ticket. No photographic evidence of the engines being cut, crushed, or rendered inoperable. The paper trail simply ended at the word destruction, as though writing it down had been enough to make it true. Megan pulled the hauling invoice. Lakefront disposal. $1,800 for transport and deposit of 8 units. The delivery address was not a scrapyard. It was not a demolition facility. It was a machine shop on South Chase Avenue, Milwaukee. She drove there herself. No attorneys. No advance call. She took the highway south and exited on Chase Avenue, passing body shops, welding suppliers, and a boarded-up foundry before she found the address on the hauling invoice. She found the lot behind a cinder block building with a roll-up door and a hand-painted sign that read Lawson Machine Works. She found the 8 engines, several with their housings already removed, internal components exposed to the open air, arranged in a row along the back fence with more care than scrap metal usually receives. And she found Brett Lawson crouched beside engine number 5, a socket wrench in one hand, cleaning corrosion from a fuel nozzle assembly with a wire brush. His movements were steady, practiced, methodical. He had clearly been at this for days. He looked up when her shoes crossed the gravel at the edge of the lot. Megan introduced herself, CEO of Collier Power Systems. She explained that the engines had been disposed of through a company decommission process and that the company needed them returned for an active federal contract. Brett stood up slowly. He set the wrench on the engine housing, positioned it carefully so it would not roll. He told her the engines had been dumped on his property without his consent, without a bill of sale, without a transfer agreement, and without his signature on any document. He had not requested them. He had not agreed to store them. No one from Collier Power Systems had contacted him before, during, or after the delivery. Under Wisconsin's abandoned property statute, property left on private land without documentation or agreement becomes the landowner's after a reasonable period. His voice was level, the same tone he might use to explain why a cylinder head needed resurfacing. He did not stop looking at her while he said it. Megan asked if he would consider returning them voluntarily. Brett picked up the wrench and went back to the fuel nozzle. He did not answer. Megan returned to Collier headquarters and told Paul the 8 LX8 prototypes were not destroyed. They were sitting in a machine shop on the south side of the city, and the man who ran the shop was restoring them with the kind of precision that suggested he knew exactly what he was working on. Something passed across Paul's face. Not surprise, something smaller and quicker, like a calculation completing behind the eyes. He recovered and suggested dispatching a corporate security team to retrieve the units. Company property, he said, removed without authorization. Megan stopped him. There was no authorization on the company's side either. No disposal contract. No chain of custody documentation. Nothing that proved the engines had been legally consigned to anyone. Collier Power Systems had loaded them onto a flatbed and dropped them on a stranger's lot without so much as a phone call. She consulted the legal department. 2 senior attorneys reviewed the full file, the disposal manifest, the hauling invoice, the absence of any bill of sale or transfer agreement, and reached the same conclusion within the hour. Wisconsin statute was unambiguous. Abandoned property left on private land without written agreement, receipt, or acknowledgement from the receiving party transfers ownership to the landowner after a reasonable period. There was no signed disposal contract. There was no communication with the property owner. There was no evidence that anyone at Collier Power Systems had so much as called Brett Lawson before dropping several tons of industrial equipment on his lot. The company had no legal basis to demand return, and any attempt to force recovery would expose the company to a conversion claim that would cost more in legal fees than the engines were worth on paper. Paul pushed back, eminent domain arguments, commercial necessity, the DOE timeline. He spoke for several minutes about precedent and urgency. Megan let him finish. Then she ended the discussion with one sentence. We created this problem. She went back to Brett's shop 2 days later. This time she did not bring a demand. She did not bring attorneys or a revised offer. She stood at the edge of the lot, her hands at her sides, and watched him work. He was recalibrating the turbine shaft on engine number 2, using a dial indicator mounted on a magnetic base, rotating the shaft by hand in quarter-degree increments. His movements were precise and unhurried. not the movements of a man fixing someone else's machine, but of someone returning to something he understood at a level below language. He checked the runout at 12 points around the rotation, recording each measurement in a small notebook with a pencil stub he kept behind his ear. When a reading was off, he shimmed the bearing mount by a fraction of a thousandth of an inch and measured again. She asked about the engines. Not whether he would return them. She asked what they were, how they worked. Brett explained the LX8 cooling system without looking up from the dial indicator. He described the airflow channels machined into the blade roots, how they directed compressed air across the hottest internal surfaces of the turbine, reducing thermal stress without sacrificing combustion efficiency. He spoke about the alloy composition, the grain structure of the nickel-cobalt blades, the way the crystal lattice held together under temperatures that would destroy conventional steel in minutes. He spoke the way a person speaks about something they have lived inside of for years, without notes, without hesitation. Every measurement and every material cited from memory. Megan listened. She did not interrupt. And she understood, not every technical detail, but something more important. This man had not learned about these engines from a manual. He had not studied them from the outside. He had made them. She did not ask how he knew. Not yet. She left the shop without pressing for anything. Megan spent the following week inside the company archives. She requested the complete project history of the LX8 program from the records department, every engineering report, every team roster, every budget allocation from inception through decommission. The files filled 2 bankers' boxes and a shared drive folder with over 400 documents. The original engineering team lead was listed on page 1 of the program charter, Brett R. Lawson, Senior Propulsion Engineer, 2014 through 2021. She opened his personnel file. 14 patents registered to his name. 3 industry engineering awards, including the ASME Gas Turbine Award in 2019, the highest honor in the field. He had designed the entire LX8 from initial concept through prototype fabrication. Every critical innovation, the cooling geometry, the alloy composition, the blade root airflow channels, originated from his work. His performance reviews used the same phrase 3 years running. Irreplaceable technical asset. She pulled the restructuring memo that had eliminated the R&D division in 2021. 3 pages, single-spaced, written and signed by Paul Linden. The central argument, commercial unviability. Paul had concluded the LX8 had no realistic market pathway, that the prototype costs were irrecoverable, and that the division's headcount should be absorbed into existing operations. The memo was addressed to Arthur Collier, who had approved it during the final months of his illness, a period when, as Megan now understood, her father had been signing approvals on trust rather than judgment, leaning on the institutional knowledge of men like Paul to carry the decisions he no longer had the strength to scrutinize. She sat in the records room for a long time after reading the memo, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, the banker's boxes stacked around her. She read the memo twice more. She read Brett's final performance review, the one written 3 months before the restructuring was announced. The language was unambiguous, irreplaceable technical asset. The reviewer was the division director. The approving signature was Arthur Collier's. Her father had called Brett irreplaceable in May. Paul had eliminated his position in September. But the DOE was now offering $200 million specifically because the LX8 exceeded every efficiency threshold on the market. The program Paul had called commercially dead was the most valuable engineering asset Collier Power Systems had ever produced. Megan drove to South Chase Avenue for the 3rd time. The energy between them was different now. She knew who Brett Lawson was, not the machine shop owner, but the engineer who had created the most important technology her company possessed. She knew what he had built, and she knew what had been done to him, not by accident, not by market forces, but by a specific person with a specific signature on a specific document. She did not say any of this directly, but her questions changed. She asked about the thermal cycling data, whether the prototypes had been tested beyond the original certification envelope. She asked about the blade root geometry in the 4th stage compressor. She asked questions that no one asks unless they have read an engineering file cover to cover and understood what they were reading. Brett noticed the shift. He answered each question fully. He did not ask why she suddenly knew what to ask. They walked the row of engines together. Brett stopped at each one and described what it needed, corroded fuel manifold, worn bearing seals, a misaligned compressor stage that could be corrected with shimming. He spoke about each engine the way a surgeon speaks about a patient: specific, calm, certain. At engine number 6 he paused. He ran his hand along the housing. Whoever classified these as catastrophic failure never opened the housing. Megan's jaw tightened. She said nothing. That afternoon, a rust-colored pickup truck pulled into the lot. Roy Gatlin, 64, retired senior machinist, 31 years at Collier Power Systems, climbed out carrying 2 coffees from the gas station on Oklahoma Avenue. He stopped when he saw the engines. He set the coffees down. He walked the row. He touched the housing of engine number 3. He looked at Brett. "Those are yours." But what Roy said next, what he had carried quietly for 3 years, is the reason Megan Collier's company would eventually write a check for $8 million. Roy stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the 8 engines on the concrete, and told Brett the thing nobody at Collier Power Systems had ever said out loud. After Brett left the company in 2021, Paul Linden had filed an insurance claim on the LX8 prototypes. The claim classified all 8 engines as catastrophic metallurgical failure, total loss, destroyed per standard decommission protocol. The insurer paid out $3.2 million. Roy had heard it through the plant floor. A machinist in the testing bay had seen the paperwork cross a desk it never should have touched. Word moved the way it always does in a facility where people have worked shoulder to shoulder for decades, not through meetings or memos, but through the break room, the parking lot, the quiet exchange between 2 people standing at adjacent machines. Everybody on the floor knew. Nobody said anything. Paul Linden had been at the company for 19 years. The people who raised questions about Paul Linden did not stay for 20. Brett listened without moving. When Roy finished, Brett walked to engine number 1 and crouched beside it. He aimed his flashlight at the exterior data plate, the stamped metal tag carrying the serial number, model designation, and manufacturing date. The plate had been partially ground down. Someone had taken an angle grinder to it, removing the serial number and the model designation. But they had only ground the exterior. Inside the housing, Brett's engineering stamps were untouched, BRL, followed by the fabrication date on each unit. Paul had not known those stamps existed. He had tried to erase the engine's identity from the outside. He had not thought to look within. Megan was running her own investigation at the same time, following a parallel thread that would converge with Brett's discovery within days. She pulled the insurance records from Collier's risk management files and found Paul's claim: $3.2 million for the total loss of 8 LX8 prototype turbine units. Signed by Paul Linden. Dated 6 weeks before the engines appeared on Brett's lot. She cross-referenced the claim date with the lakefront disposal invoice. $1,800 for transport and deposit, filed the same day Paul submitted the insurance claim. He had collected $3.2 million for assets he described as destroyed on the same morning. He paid a hauler $1,800 to dump them at a machine shop. But the insurance claim, as large as it was, turned out to be only one layer of the fraud. Megan's general counsel flagged an anomaly in the company's intellectual property access logs. Several months before the engines were disposed of, a large volume of LX8 technical data, CAD drawings, metallurgical test reports, thermal cycling results, blade geometry specifications, and proprietary alloy formulations, had been downloaded from the company's secure engineering server. The access credentials belonged to Paul's office account. The data had been transmitted to a firm called Lakeshore Technical Consulting, registered in Brookfield, Wisconsin. Lakeshore had no website, no listed employees, and no public client history. It was registered to Paul Linden's brother-in-law. Lakeshore Technical had received a single payment of $4.1 million from Grantham Industrial, a competing turbine manufacturer headquartered in Dayton, Ohio, 2 weeks after receiving the LX8 data package. Total fraud: $3.2 million in insurance proceeds for engines that were never destroyed, plus $4.1 million in payments for proprietary technology sold to a direct competitor. $7.3 million routed through a shell company, authorized by a man who had spent 19 years building exactly enough institutional trust to ensure that no one would look twice at his signature on a disposal form. Paul had not simply scrapped 8 engines. He had eliminated the physical evidence, collected the insurance money, and sold the technology that made them irreplaceable. Megan convened an emergency session of the board's audit committee the following Monday. She presented the evidence in sequence: the insurance claim with no corresponding destruction certificate, the hauling invoice dated the same day, the IP access logs showing bulk downloads from the engineering server, the shell company registration in Brookfield, and the $4.1 million payment from Grantham Industrial. She laid each document on the conference table in chronological order and did not editorialize. The paper trail did its own talking. Paul was summoned. He arrived with outside counsel, a corporate defense attorney from a downtown firm he had retained over the weekend. He attempted to reframe. The engines had genuinely failed metallurgical standards. The insurance claim followed the company's standard asset write-off procedure. The data transfer was part of a routine technology sharing exploration that had never materialized into a formal agreement. Megan set the DOE contract offer on the table: $200 million. A federal agency had evaluated the LX-8 and concluded it was the most advanced industrial turbine platform in the country. The engines Paul had classified as catastrophic failures were the ones the Department of Energy wanted to certify for a 5-year national efficiency program. Paul's attorney asked for a recess. The committee chair denied it. The evidence was too clean, the timeline too precise, the shell company too transparent. Each piece of documentation confirmed the one before it: the insurance claim without a destruction certificate, the hauling invoice on the same date, the server access logs pointing to Paul's credentials, the shell company registered to a family member. There was no ambiguity to argue with. There was no alternative interpretation that held together for more than 30 seconds. 3 board members who had served alongside Arthur Collier for more than a decade sat with their hands flat on the table, looking at the documents. One of them, a man who had attended Arthur's funeral and spoken at the reception afterward, removed his reading glasses and set them on the table in a way that made it clear he had finished reading. When they finally spoke, it was only to call the vote. 7-1. Paul Linden was terminated effective immediately. Security escorted him from the building with his outside counsel. The full case file, insurance records, IP access logs, shell company registration, Grantham payment confirmation, and the original disposal manifest, was referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Wisconsin. The expected charges: federal wire fraud for the fraudulent insurance claim, and trade secret misappropriation under the Defend Trade Secrets Act for the unauthorized sale of proprietary engineering data to a direct competitor. The one dissenting vote came from a board member Paul had personally recruited to the committee 2 years earlier. He did not speak during the discussion. He voted no without explanation. No one asked him to provide one. That evening, Megan sat in her office on the 9th floor with the lights off, the Milwaukee skyline visible through the glass wall behind her desk. She picked up her phone and called Brett. It was the first time she had reached out by phone rather than driving to his shop. She told him what had happened: the board vote, the termination, the federal referral. Brett was quiet on the line for a long time. She could hear the ambient hum of his shop in the background, the refrigerator compressor, the tick of metal cooling after a long day. He is the one who shut down the division. I know. The line stayed open. Neither said anything else for a while. Then Megan said goodnight, and Brett said goodnight, and they hung up. It was the most either of them had said to each other that was not about engines. Collier Power Systems needed the 8 LX-8 prototypes for DOE certification testing. Without the physical hardware, the $200 million contract would disappear. There was no alternative turbine platform in the company's portfolio. There were no backup units anywhere in the world. The 8 engines sitting on Brett Lawson's lot in Milwaukee were the only LX-8 prototypes that had ever been manufactured. The engines belonged to Brett. Wisconsin law was unambiguous on that point, and the company's own legal team had confirmed it weeks earlier. Megan could have challenged it in court. Her attorneys estimated 2 to 3 years of litigation with a high probability of losing. The absence of any disposal contract, any bill of sale, any signature from Brett made the company's position functionally indefensible. She did not file a claim. Instead, she did something no one on the board expected. She commissioned an independent appraisal, not a company valuation, not an internal estimate, but a third-party forensic assessment designed to determine what the engines were actually worth on the open market. The appraiser was a forensic asset specialist from a firm in Chicago that handled industrial equipment valuations for insurance carriers and federal agencies. He had no ties to Collier, to the DOE, or to anyone in the turbine industry. He spent 4 full days at Brett's shop, inspecting the engines one by one, reviewing the metallurgical specifications against published industry standards, analyzing the proprietary alloy compositions that could not be sourced or fabricated by any other manufacturer on the planet, and calculating the cost of reproducing the prototypes from raw materials. His report concluded that rebuilding the 8 engines from scratch would require a minimum of 3 years of engineering work, assuming the original design knowledge still existed in-house, which, given that the engineer who created them had been pushed out 4 years earlier, it did not. His report valued the 8 engines at $8 million. The figure reflected the nickel-cobalt superalloy blades, manufactured through a proprietary casting process Brett himself had developed, for which no alternative supply chain existed anywhere in the commercial or defense sector. It reflected the irreplaceable status of the prototypes as the only physical embodiments of the LX-8 design ever manufactured. And it reflected the DOE contract timeline. Every month of delay carried a projected revenue loss that made $8 million look modest by comparison. The number was not a negotiation tactic. It was an honest accounting of what 8 engines were worth to the only company in the world that needed them. Megan brought the appraisal to Brett's shop on a Tuesday afternoon. She set it on his workbench, next to a torque wrench and a can of penetrating oil. No attorneys, no board members, just her and the document. Brett read it. He turned each page without expression. When he reached the final number, he set the report down. I did not keep them for the money. I know. He was quiet for another moment. Then he stated his condition. He would agree to the sale, but he would personally supervise the restoration and the DOE certification testing. Every engine, every recalibration, every test run, his designs, his standards. No one else's hands on the work unless he approved it. Megan agreed without hesitation. She did not consult legal. She did not ask for a counteroffer or a revised scope. She extended her hand, and he took it, and the deal was done on a workbench in a 2-bay shop on the south side of Milwaukee. And here is where everything circles back. Not to the money, not to the contract, but to the man who built the engines standing once again in the building where he once built them. Brett Lawson walked through the main entrance of Collier Power Systems on a Monday morning, 9 weeks after 8 engines had been dumped on his lot. He wore the same steel-toed boots he wore in his shop. He carried a canvas tool bag he had packed himself. A contractor's badge was clipped to his chest pocket, not an employee badge, not a visitor's pass. He walked the main corridor toward the testing bay. The layout had not changed. The floor markings, the safety placards, the hum of the ventilation system, all the same. But the nameplates on the office doors were different, and the R&D wing, where he had spent 7 years, was now a storage area stacked with sales materials and trade show displays. He set his tool bag down in the clean room and began. The restoration took weeks. Brett worked methodically, replacing corroded housings, remachining bearing surfaces, recalibrating fuel nozzle assemblies, replacing degraded seals with components manufactured to his original specifications. He brought in tooling from his own shop when the facility's equipment did not meet his tolerances. The engineering team at Collier watched him through the observation window. Some of them had been junior staff when he was on the floor. They watched the way he moved, the economy of motion, the certainty, the way his hands found the right bolt without his eyes leaving the gauge. He never checked a manual. He never pulled up a specification on the terminal. He knew every tolerance by memory, every clearance by feel. On a Saturday afternoon in late October, Jake came to the facility. Brett met him at the security desk and walked him to the clean room. The 8 engines sat in a row on test stands, housings open, internals gleaming under fluorescent light. Jake walked the row the way Brett walked it, slowly, carefully. At engine number 3, he stopped. He reached up and placed his hand flat against the turbine housing. The same gesture, the same spot on the metal, the same quiet pressure. Megan was standing at the observation window on the mezzanine above. She saw the boy's hand mirror his father's, the same instinct, the same stillness. She stood there for a long moment, and then turned back to the paperwork behind her. The weeks moved. Brett handled the engineering. Megan handled the DOE submissions, the certification paperwork, the timeline coordination with the program office in Washington. They worked in parallel, separate offices, separate domains. But their paths crossed every evening in the testing bay after the rest of the staff had gone home. Late nights in the facility. Coffee from the break room machine. Conversations that started with turbine data and ended somewhere quieter. Not personal, not confessional, but the kind of exchange that happens between two people who have stopped performing and started simply being present. He would tell her what he had done that day on engine number 4, and she would tell him what the DOE liaison had said about the timeline. And then neither of them would talk for a while, and the silence between them was not empty. Neither of them named what it was. They did not need to. The DOE certification testing ran for 11 days. Each engine was mounted on a dynamometer stand in Collier's primary test cell, connected to instrumentation arrays measuring thermal output, vibration amplitude, efficiency ratio, and emissions across every stage of the operating cycle: startup, ramp, steady state, overload, cool down. Federal inspectors from the DOE's Office of Fossil Energy observed every run, recording data independently on their own equipment. Brett stood at the control console for each of the 88 individual test sequences, hands resting on the edge of the panel, watching the data feed scroll in real time. He did not sit. He did not delegate the monitoring to the junior engineers who stood behind him. He watched every number the way he had watched them when these engines first fired 7 years ago, with the same posture, the same focus, the same quiet certainty that what he had built would hold. On the 11th day, the lead federal inspector signed the certification form for the final engine, number 8, at 4:17 in the afternoon. All 8 passed. Every efficiency metric exceeded the DOE's minimum threshold. Several exceeded it by margins the inspectors said they had never recorded from a prototype stage platform. The LX8 series was certified for the Department of Energy's Advanced Turbine Program. The $200 million contract was approved, and Collier Power Systems was named sole source provider for the initiative's first phase. The contract would sustain the company for 5 years and secure over 300 jobs at the Milwaukee facility. Paul Linden was indicted by a federal grand jury 3 weeks after the certification. 9 counts. 4 counts of wire fraud related to the insurance claim, 3 counts of trade secret theft under the Defend Trade Secrets Act, and 2 counts of money laundering for routing $7.3 million through Lakeshore Technical Consulting. The shell company was dissolved by court order. Grantham Industrial returned the complete LX8 technical data package under a consent decree negotiated by the Department of Justice. Paul's brother-in-law cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. 2 weeks after the indictment, the board of directors extended Brett Lawson a formal offer. Chief Technology Officer, reporting directly to the CEO, with full authority over the engineering division and a permanent seat on the executive committee. A corner office on the 9th floor, in the same building where he had once been reassigned to a windowless room to catalog his own specifications. Brett read the offer letter in his shop that evening. He folded it and set it on the workbench. He told the board he would consider it. On a Thursday evening in late October, Brett was in his shop on South Chase Avenue, wiping down the workbench while Jake sat on the stool reading a library book, 1 foot hooked around the stool leg. The roll-up door was halfway up. The lot outside was empty, the concrete still marked with 8 rectangular oil stains where the engines had sat, like shadows of something that was no longer there. A car pulled into the lot. Not a company vehicle. A personal one. Megan walked through the roll-up door. She carried a single envelope, the DOE approval letter, countersigned by the program director in Washington, with the Department of Energy seal embossed in the corner. She sat on the bench across from Brett. He set down the rag. She placed the envelope on the workbench between them, next to the folded offer letter, which was still sitting exactly where he had left it. The shop was quiet. The fluorescent overhead hummed. Outside, the last light drained from the sky, turning the chain-link fence and the gravel the color of old iron. Jake looked up from his book. He glanced at his father, then at Megan, then back at the page. He turned it and kept reading. Brett reached forward, not toward the envelope, not toward the offer letter. His hand came to rest on the scarred surface of the workbench, in the space between the 2 documents, close to where her hand lay beside the approval letter. Megan did not pull away. She did not move closer. She left her hand where it was. Outside, a truck downshifted on the avenue. The sound faded. The shop settled into the kind of silence that does not need to be filled. He had not kept the engines for the money. She had known that from the first time she watched him touch the metal.